So let's go to New York. Let's bring in Philippe Bolopion. For decades, a well-known human rights advocate and journalist. He is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Welcome to the programme, Philippe. Great to have you with us tonight. You've made clear in recent statements that you see all sides showing, quote, open disregard for international norms.
Yeah, it's really, I would say, in the last month, a new phenomenon and a really dangerous rhetoric used by the leaders in the US, in Iran, in Israel as well, showing almost, open disregard for international law, for the laws of war that are supposed to govern the conduct of the warring parties and are designed to limit the impact of war on civilians. And yet there is almost a sort of proud disregard from all parties to this conflict when it comes to international law. That's quite new. It's not new, of course, that people will violate the laws of war. That's happened many, many times, sadly, in the past. But in the past, leaders were pretending it was not happening, or that it happened by mistake. They were not making statements like, for example, President Trump recently, that was conveying that they were actually planning on violating international law. When US President Donald Trump threatened to obliterate power plants in Iran, that's a potential violation of international law. These are civilian objects that are indispensable for civilians to continue with their daily life, and yet they become a sort of pawn of war in this type of speeches. And sadly, it's not just the US, but also Israel and Iran.
We heard that justification on a smaller level, didn't we, a few days ago with the Israeli IDF force saying when they struck the South Pars facility, the energy facility of Iran, they did so because it was, quote, a dual-use facility. Yes, it was for civilians and it was for processing, but also not just processing energy. It could also be turned into ammonium, into explosives. So this was stopping the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard. Where does the argument stand when it comes to dual-use justification?
So, that's when you enter into a more complex analysis that can't be done in theory, but has to be applied to a specific situation. There might be some limited cases where a facility that has a civilian use can be a legitimate military target, but there is a proportionality analysis that comes into play in this type of situations. Does the military objective you're pursuing with this military attack, is it justified, and does it permit you to incur a cost for civilians? So it's a proportionality calculation that lawyers are trained to conduct. But the fact that a civilian facility may have a marginal military use is usually not enough to justify obliterating it.
When you compare that to what you've just said, if the actions match the rhetoric in the days to come, the President Trump saying that we will, quote, obliterate Iran's power plants, as you see it, that's way beyond proportionality.
Exactly. This type of blanket statements not only convey complete disregard for international law, which is incredibly corrosive, right? The words of leaders matter. In a time of war, these words have weight and they have consequences. And sadly, over the last few months, US President Donald Trump has been very open with regard to his contempt for the international rules-based order, international law, the norms, the treaties, the institutions that have been built patiently over the last few decades to sort of improve the fate of civilians in conflict. So a blanket statement like this one is sort of bragging about potentially very serious violations of international law and of the laws of war. And they should be called out by leaders around the world, including US allies. All the parties to the Geneva Conventions have really a responsibility, an obligation even, to call out violations of the convention. And when a country like the US openly makes this type of statements, their allies, but other countries around the world should call them out. Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, as a couple of weeks ago openly said that in Iran, his troop would give no quarters which means that, even if Iranian soldiers were to try to surrender, they would not be spared by US forces. That's a sort of textbook example of a violation of the Geneva Conventions. It's coming from the highest levels of the US government, and it's deeply corrosive and deeply worrying.
If we look at the UN Charter, this is where we have to go back to international law to look at a country's right to defend itself, the right of self-defence under Article 51, twofold to use force, one if you're as a nation under armed attack, twofold if there's an imminent armed attack, anticipatory self-defence is required. Or you get an agreement at Security Council, which we know hasn't been the case this time round. So my first question to you, we go back 24 hours. We listened to President Trump again, and he says Iran was, quote, 2 to 4 weeks away from creating a nuclear weapon, to which he said it has remained and still remains a continuing threat to the lives of Americans and Israelis. Where do you sit on that reasoning?
So, our mandate at Human Rights Watch is a bit peculiar in that sense. We don't comment on the decision to go to war or the legality of that decision per se, because we see our role as being the sort of objective arbiter of how war is being conducted and not whether any given war is legitimate or not. I would say in this case, if you look to the well-respected experts in the field, you will have the answer that you are looking for. This is not by any measure a sort of close call or complex determination to make. But as a human rights organization, we stay away from that because we want to be really neutral when we are calling out the behavior of the parties. When the US, for example, bombs a school in southern Iran, we want to be able to call out specifically this situation as a violation of the laws of war. So we don't really comment on the decision to go to war, only on how war is being conducted.
I see where you're coming from. To rule out any perceived bias from right at the outset, you're looking objectively as you can, whatever party it is. And to that case, can I ask you about when it comes to Iran's attacks on energy facilities in the Gulf, of innocent parties in this case, just that process in itself, and again, you go back to the proportionality which you touched upon with the rhetoric of Trump when it came to the power plants, and where you see that falling in terms of alleged possibility of war crimes.
Well, of course, the very same rules apply to the Iranian regime. These civilian facilities are presumably not military targets. So when the Iranian army attacks energy facilities, but also residential buildings in the Gulf countries, airports, the shipping, the shipping lanes, the civilian ships that are moving oil on the shores of their coast, they are committing serious violations of the laws of war. These objects are not fair game in the Geneva Conventions. They are not military objects. And targeting them has profound consequences for the rest of the world. It brings the price of oil up, the price of food up, and it can really affect negatively a vulnerable population literally all over the world, and in particular, in this case, in Asia. So whatever, formidable the enemies of Iran are, it doesn't justify using these kind of tactics that have negative repercussions for civilians.
So if we look at Human Rights Watch, if you look at your organisation, to document abuses, to pressure governments and groups to stop them, to investigate, to report, to advocate, and then I ask you to the scale of this question now, how can you document alleged war crimes right now, crimes against humanity, breaches in such a vast region? You talked about some of the Gulf states. We're dealing with an expanded conflict, more than 10 countries either involved or directly affected by war. Tell me about the work you're trying to do in that remit right now.
Look, it's very challenging. As you described it, the war is intensifying. It has spread out. It involves many parties. And we have already documented very serious violations by a range of parties. We've mentioned some of the US, of Iran. The Israeli authorities have used white phosphorus to bomb some homes in Lebanon, which is an extremely dangerous and cruel weapon. And of course, several of these parties have a long track record of committing very, very serious crime. The Israeli authorities for the last 2.5 years have been engaged in acts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity in Gaza. We hear that, that the situation in the West Bank continues to be extremely concerning. The Iranian authorities in January killed mowed down thousands of peaceful protesters on the street, and are still, threatening to continue to do the same if anyone goes out to protest the policies of the Iranian regime. So it's a very, very challenging situation for human rights organizations to even keep up with. And don't forget, this is happening in a world that's as the UN Secretary General often says, that is on fire with conflicts in many other areas. We are working on Burkina Faso. We are working on Sudan. We are still working, of course, on Ukraine, on Myanmar. So what's happening in Iran today, the sort of disregard for international law, in fact reflects a more global trend of a world that's becoming more authoritarian, where superpowers like the US, Russia, and China are more and more challenging the rules-based world order and the entire infrastructure of norms and rules that have been created to protect civilians and to enforce the laws of war. So we are, I would say definitely on the back foot as a human rights organization. Mm-hmm. At the same time, in times like this is when we rise up to meet the moment. And if you look at the research our colleagues have produced in the last few weeks, it's extremely impressive.
Your work matters. It clearly matters, Philippe. When we look at the documented work that you're doing, the evidence that you carried out, the consistency that you talk about with international law. But I would ask the question about the weight it's given, the impact that governments clearly play by either acknowledging it and they're putting in sanctions or investigations, or ignoring it. And we're in a situation right now where I would ask, what voice does Human Rights Watch have at the table? We heard Tom Fletcher, the head of the humanitarian segment, the UNHCR of the UN, saying no one is listening right now.
Look, it's clear that in a situation like that, it's easy to sort of lose faith in the system. But if we do that, who will be left to defend these rules, these norms that the world has patiently created to help improve the fate of civilians? So there is still hope, even in a moment like this. In fact, we are really looking to countries around the world who are middle powers or smaller countries that still believe in human rights, still believe in the rule of law, to rise up and band together to create a global coalition of democracies, of countries that want to protect the rules-based world order, to push back against countries like the US or China or Russia or these days Iran or Israel that are openly violating the rules of law. You may remember the speech, for example, of the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, in Davos, calling for this type of coalition. Imagine if all of these countries, European, but South Africa, Brazil, and South Korea, and Japan, and Australia, and Canada all band together and demand that the US, Iran, and Israel respect the laws of war and push for accountability at the International Criminal Court or in UN forums. It can make a difference. But if nobody stands up in a moment like that, then yes, we'll see a slow degradation of the global environment in which we are.
Really good to talk to you tonight, Philippe, and listen to the work you're doing as well. Philippe Bolopion, thank you, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch.